Well, welcome back to the History of the Restoration Movement Lecture Archive. This is module number 4, and in this module we will be talking about vestments, and specifically the Protestant tendency from about the 1550s and later to have what are known as anti-vestment tendencies. And so we are going to look at the backlash against clerical vestments and how this basically sets up the egalitarian frontier mindset that we're going to see and gives a very real visual manifestation of that ideal, because what's going to happen is the clergy are going to look very similar to the laity, thus eroding a barrier between a priestly class and the regular enlisted ranks of the church. But first, let us begin with our Communings in the Sanctuary meditation by Robert Richardson. Communings in the Sanctuary, meditation number 8, originally published in the Millennial Harbinger, January 1849, on pages 49 through 51. This is a meditation based on Psalm 48, verse 9. We have thought of thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of thy temple. How charming is the natural scenery around us. How beautiful the lofty hills which enclose this fertile valley like a gigantic circumvallation. How picturesque their varied forms here, their gently sloping sides, the rich pastures reaching to their summits, and there, precipitous and rock-ribbed, crowned with native forest. How pure and bright the blue heavens above. How grateful and soft verdure the earth beneath. How great the joys of existence. How dear those sensibilities which connect us with these objects. But here shall the dubious and despondent thought point to those tombs and say, this world indeed would be beautiful if there were no graves. And truly, time was when there was none. Time was when God himself looked upon the land, the sea, and all that they contain, upon this verdant earth and the blue heavens, and blessed them in their beauty. How glorious in their charms! How abundant and undefiled their joys! No sorrow nor sign rent the suffering breast, nor pain nor anguish agonize the frame, nor decay nor malady or violence led trembling captives to grace the triumphs of death. For life, then, reigned supreme amidst scenes of pure felicity, over realms uninvaded by hostile foot and unvisited by fear of change. And there were no graves. But what made these graves and erected these monuments of death? What malignant power has marred the beauties of the world and robbed it of its joys? Are these not the consequences of sin, the desolations of death, the woes of mortality, and the sad tokens of guilt and condemnation? O sin, you sting of death, you minister of woe, how great have been your victories! How vast thy conquered realms! How galling the tyranny of your power! These are thy trophies, more widely spread than the Grecian or Roman conquerors. These are thy triumphs, unfettered by mountain chains, and unlimited by ocean depths. These memorials are in the dark caves of the deep waters and upon the high places of the earth. Thine, indeed, O death, is the only universal empire that has ever flourished. How vain indeed the enterprises of Alexander, the laurels of Caesar, the victories of Napoleon. It was by you, O death, that they conquered, and it was by you that they themselves were subdued. They reigned over only a few territories, over a few of the peoples in a single generation. But you, O death, have reigned over all lands, all earth-born tribes, and all generations of men. Shall we say then, it is death that robs us of our joys? It is the grave that mars the beauty of this world? Surely it is not death, because by death is which Christ triumphed. Surely it is not the grave in which Jesus once reposed. No, Death now to us is a gate of heavenly joy. These graves are now earth's glory, since that of Jesus is among them. Behold his tomb. It is no proud monument to earthly pride, no Egyptian pyramid, no spacious mausoleum to commemorate not the dead who lie beneath, their very names now unknown, but the power of death that conquered them. It is no lofty pillar reaching to the clouds erected by human hands. Instead, a native rock, a fit sepulchre for the author of nature, a grave whose deep recesses have brought forth life and incorruptibility, and which is not a memorial, not of the dead, and neither of death, but of the living and of life. These tombs, then, shall no longer mar the beauty of the world around us, since that of Jesus makes them but emblems of the destruction of the grave and a type of the joy which is to come. Let us then approach their salutary shelter and dwell amidst their shades. Let the sorrows of death become our joys, its mournings our rejoicing. Let tears be sweeter than laughter, and prayer sweeter than merriment, and penitence sweeter than pride, and Christ himself sweeter than all the world, and his cross and sepulchre sweeter than home with all of its joys. For death is now the Christian's captive, and the grave is his legacy of life, a dawn of mortality's night, the spring of an endless year that will know no winter. So, I would like to begin our next Longue Duree discussion with this question. What does your pastor, or your preacher if you prefer, what does his uniform look like? When your pastor or preacher gets into the pulpit, what clothing signifies his office, if any? I'd like to point out here that in this slide we have 6 stereotypical vestments. In the lower left we have probably the classic vestment of the 1700s. It is black. It has clear Christian imagery, but it also doesn't have much in the way of frills. It doesn't communicate ostentatiousness. But at the same time, it clearly communicates this is a person who is about the business of the church. It is somewhat somber, doesn't have much in the way of color. Now, the uniform above is much more indicative of the late 1800s, early and mid 1900s in particular. It is the 2 to 3 piece suit. It is the sport coat, the tie, the button-down shirt, the matching slacks. This, in many ways, became the Protestant uniform of choice for the 20th century. And good or bad, when most people today hear the word preacher, this is often what they think of, or at least when they hear the term senior minister. Now, below that to the left, we have an Anglican priest. Now, notice he too is wearing a button-down shirt, but instead of the sport jacket, he has a clerical collar. In many ways, this is an older example of a vestment, the clerical collar often being indicative of what are known as liturgical churches. So we typically find this kind of dress in Anglican, Roman Catholic, and some Eastern Orthodox style garments. Notice that, like the person to his left, he also wears symbols of his Christianity. He wears what is known as a pectoral cross. Notice that the preaching uniform above of the 20th century preacher, while it is a nice outfit, it communicates authority and respect. It does not necessarily contain overtly Christian symbolism in it. Now, further to the right, we have a Roman Catholic priest in a full robe ready to celebrate the Mass. Now, this one in particular I found interesting because the triangle shape of the area which is known as the cowl, the triangular shape of that garment is meant to suggest Trinitarian themes. The stole coming down the front is meant to be a symbol of this person's authority to perform a sacrament. Notice here that the objects on this man's clothing are meant to signify certain theological realities, but they're not explained. And they certainly don't have wording or writing to say what they mean. Likewise, he is wearing a green cloak, or specifically a green robe. And this is made to communicate that they are in what is known as ordinary time. It's not the season of Lent, it's not Christmas, it's not Easter, it's not Pentecost, or otherwise it'd be red. It's not Easter, otherwise it'd be white. It's not Christmas, otherwise it'd be purple. They are celebrating ordinary time. And you can tell we are in ordinary time based on his green outfit. Now, below the Catholic priest, we have what is frequently known as the stereotypical youth pastor, or more in the last 20 years, it's moved from being the youth pastor to the church planter in a small but seeker-sensitive church. Notice how this pastor has specifically chosen a clothing style that it virtually would make him indistinguishable from other people in his audience. There is no overt Christian symbols on his outfit. There is nothing about what he is wearing that suggests that he fulfills a special role in the church. You couldn't just pick him out of a crowd. And what I'd like to suggest is that this is going to be the logical conclusion of our study, that we will start to see this kind of dress become normative in Christianity, especially in the last 20 to 30 years. This idea will become very normative in Protestantism. And finally, there to the far right, we have an Eastern Orthodox bishop. Notice that he has many symbols of Christianity, crosses, pectoral cross, a specialized hat that displays the cross. But also notice that it is somewhat pretentious. This has quite a lot of precious metal to it. And it shows a theology that says to be in the clerical ranks, to be among the priestly class, is to handle a certain amount of worldly responsibility, and with that comes a certain amount of worldly glory. These are expensive items he is wearing, and they are symbols of his office. So let us keep all of that in mind as we look through this Longue Duree topic of vestments, and specifically the vestment controversy of the Puritans. Now, part of the reason I began by showing all of those different things that have in times past and in the present qualified as a Christian vestment is because the idea of wearing specialized clothing for worship is not a new concept. In fact, it's not even a Christian concept. Nearly every religion that you can study has specialized clothing that they use in their worship. But notice that in the modern era, that in Protestant churches, we've seen a shift towards what can only be called an anti-vestment stance. And many historians will note that while this trend did begin fairly early, sometimes some people put it as early as 1525, it really hits English-speaking thought in 1550 when King Edward VI tried to promote a man named John Hopper to the rank of bishop in the Anglican Church. So let's look really quickly at what Hopper declined to wear. Notice the difference between these two pictures. Hopper on the right is dressed in his normal, we'll call them street clothing. Now, notice this is by no means a poor man's outfit. It has several layers, both of linen and fur. It has a highly unnecessary layer of fringe for the neck. It has tapered sleeves so that it fits around the wrist comfortably. But also notice that when compared to the normal bishop's outfit that he would have gotten to wear, this is a marked departure. Notice he is not wearing the mitre or the crown. And notice that the bishop's crown is in fact what it looks like. It is a crown. It displays authority over people. And notice that Hopper is not wearing it. Notice also another set of symbols of the authority. The long staff known as the crozier, and the large sapphire ring on this one bishop's hand. These are the classic symbols of the bishop office. And notice that both of these symbols are also missing from this painting of John Hopper. He has no ring or no jewelry that we can tell in this picture. He is not flaunting symbols of authority. No crown, no crozier, no ring. And just in general, notice the embroidery work on the bishop to the left. That there are intricate patterns in his clothing. There is gold lace on top of rich red velvets. Hopper may not be dressed like a commoner or a peasant there on the right, but he is certainly dressed in a way that communicates, I am not in a pretentious place of lording my power over people. And this will speak volumes to people under Hopper's care, that he is, in many ways, will be looked at as a bishop of the people. Now, to this I'd like to add a comment from David Steinmetz, an American historical researcher. Steinmetz notes this on page 103 of his book, Reformers in the Wings. It's basically a book describing lesser-known reformers because, well, let's be honest, Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, the big names tend to take a lot of the limelight. And so I appreciated this book that it showed what a lot of the secondary reformers, or the second-generation reformers even, what they were up to. But he knows this about Hopper refusing to wear vestments. Quote, Hopper's refusal to wear vestments, or to be consecrated in the normal way, quickly inflated into a cause célèbre. Hopper, and those later Puritan divines who shared his convictions, were thoroughly convinced that which was not commanded in Scripture ought not to be instituted in the church. Now, Hopper did not deny outright the category of indifferent matters, but astutely observed that things regarded by one generation as indifferent are quickly hallowed by time and usage, and are regarded by the next generation as things essential. If I could put that in layman's terms, when you read your Bible, it's silent about many things. The Bible does not say in the New Testament whether a person should wear specialized clothing. And most people put this in a category of endiphora. We're indifferent. You want to wear it? Fine. You don't want to wear it? Fine. It's an indifferent matter. But here's what Hopper is afraid of, and this is important and we should note it as a potential test question. Hopper is afraid that if you do something that is in this indifferent category, and you observe it regularly, after a generation or two, it will carry a stigma of holiness. And it goes from being indifferent to essential. And Hopper is trying to nip this in the bud. He says, if we're going to do Reformation, we're going to stop wearing the clerical vestments because we don't want the other generations that follow us to think vestments are essential to Christian worship. Now, I'd like to point out that Hopper is one of the first Christians to make a call for what is called New Testament liturgicism. Now, granted, he's not the first. If you really want to find the first, we have to go all the way to Wittenberg, where a man named Karlstadt in 1525 was the first to really break from the Catholic Church, and in doing so takes off vestments and tried to do the Roman Mass in a way that was to appeal to people in the vernacular language even. So Hopper isn't the first, but you notice he makes a specific New Testament call, and I think that that's one of the things that makes Hopper's appeal very attractive to our Restoration Movement heritage. The Restoration Movement will often focus on this idea that it is not simply enough for something to be a biblical idea. We should find it in the New Testament. And Hopper is clearly calling for a New Testament authorization, because he's not denying that the Old Testament authorizes specialty garments for priests and Levites. But he does deny that the New Testament provides a command that is equivalent, meaning we don't have anything in the New Testament that says priests wear a vestment. Now, let's scan ahead a couple hundred years, and this is where the rubber is going to meet the road for our course. On the American frontier, this idea of anti-clericalism is going to rise. That there's going to be a backlash against educated clergy. There's going to be a backlash against the priestly class and the distinction between a reverend person or an ordained person and laity. Now, as these notions rise, one of the clearest visual ways to tell if someone is in the priestly class is how they're dressed. And the Restoration Movement is going to latch on to this anti-vestment idea. And they are going to specifically try to instill this notion that the pastor is not necessarily above his congregation. Now, I'd like to point to this pretty famous picture of Barton W. Stone here to the right of this slide. Stone here is preaching at the 801 Cane Ridge Revival. And I would just like to point out that he's the man on the tree stump with his arms raised and his up to the sky in proclamation. And notice that he is not substantially dressed differently from the other people gathered. He's wearing a coat, but so are several men in this picture. Several men in this picture are wearing hats. He is not. But he's not wearing anything that looks distinctive from the rest of the men in this picture. thus indicating that Stone is trying to, in many ways, place himself in the commoner's ranks. Now, in the Restoration movement, they will often joke, and they will use this term for vestments. They will often call them popish rags. And basically what they're saying is that vestments are things that the Pope introduced. That they are things that are specifically a holdover from Roman Catholicism and not from the New Testament. And as the Restoration movement begins house cleaning a lot of these traditional ideas, one of the big things that's going to go is the vestments.